Hello and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris. Excited that you're here. Looking forward to sharing some new information with you. Today's guest is Pete Malinowski. Pete comes from an aquaculture family and was a high school teacher. And a little over 10 years ago, he started something called the Billion Oyster Project. And he and his co-founder's goal is to drop 1 billion oysters into New York Harbor in an effort to bring the oysters back and clean it up. He's going to talk to us about the history of oysters, how many were there back in the 1600s, what a powerful force it was for food and people, and how they disappeared and how they're coming back. They've already put 150 million oysters into the harbor, and they're seeing tremendous results. The water's getting cleaner, which is what oysters do, and animals are coming back. The value of an oyster reef is tremendous, and his program already has 2,000 volunteers. They work with 100 different New York City schools, 30,000 students in total, and they've got relationships with 83 restaurants where they have brought out almost 3 million pounds of oyster shells, kept them out of the landfills, and instead are putting them back into the harbor. Anyway, join us. It's a blast. Pete Malinowski, the Billion Oyster Project. I think you're really going to enjoy this hour. And as always, man, thank you so much for being with us, and stay curious. Good morning and welcome to this episode of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris. And as always, I'm excited to have you here. We're going to have a fun conversation today with a gentleman named Pete Malinowski. Did I pronounce that right?
You did.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Pete is one of the co-founders of the Billion Oyster Project, founded in 2014. And we've talked to a lot of different groups about conservation and trying to save everything from grizzly bears to butterflies and whatnot. But oysters is a whole new one. And so I'm really, really looking forward to this. And Pete, I think it's going to be a blast and give you an opportunity to share some oyster information other than, you know, do I order 6 or 12? I guess is the...
Well, always 12.
Oh, oh, that's right. Your family's in the business, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
So 12 it is. Okay, perfect. So as I understand it, and I stole this from your website, you guys envisioned a healthy, biodiverse New York harbor.
Yes.
Now, that seems like a big task to take on. So why don't we start there? What day did you wake up and say, I know what we can do. We can save New York Harbor?
I was pretty new to New York City when we started working on this, and I didn't know the harbor that well or the city that well. And I met my co-founder, Billion Oyster Project, Murray Fisher, who had started a public high school all about training students for careers on the water in New York Harbor, so he taught me very quickly about the history of the ecology of New York Harbor, what happened to it, and how oyster reefs have been a very important habitat in the harbor. And it just made perfect sense. So we just started working on it right away. So it was a pretty quick process of going from knowing very little about the harbor to understanding that oysters make a difference. And
can you take us back and share with us a bit of an overview of the history of the harbor, and then we'll narrow it down to 1 billion oysters.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll try not to tell the long version of the story, but
the medium one.
Yeah, the medium one. So it's important that everyone knows that New York Harbor is a temperate estuary. What that means, an estuary is where rivers meet the sea. Estuaries are the most productive ecosystems on planet Earth. So there's more biomass per cubic meter in an estuary than in any of the environments that people typically associate with being important or worthy of preservation, like coral reefs, tropical rainforests, mangroves, although mangroves and estuaries are often in the same place. That combination of nutrient-rich fresh water meeting the ocean just results in an incredible amount of bioproductivity. New York Harbor is an estuary. It's one of the world's great estuaries. It used to be one of the most important natural ecosystems in the world. It happens to be located in the Western North Atlantic, which is one of the most important fisheries in the world. So it's just this coming together of a bunch of different factors that made New York Harbor an incredibly productive place. And so when colonists first arrived, they described not being able to see the sky for minutes at a time because there were so many birds, and being able to catch fish just by lowering baskets over the side of the boat. They encountered more animals in one place than they had ever seen or ever heard of. That type of natural abundance doesn't exist anywhere on Earth anymore because it's been removed by people. But New York City, New York Harbor used to be one of the great natural ecosystems on planet Earth. That's our starting point, right? That's where the story starts. It starts from a place of natural abundance that none of us and none of our grandparents have ever seen or heard of existing on the Earth, because we've removed all of that. And like in any other estuary, there's important habitat types that develop that are the backbone of that ecosystem. And for many, including New York Harbor, that habitat type is oyster reefs. So oyster reefs are these three-dimensional structures that grow off the bottom. They provide food and habitat for hundreds of other species, stabilize the bottom, protect the shores, and filter the water. And so it's essentially an underwater forest, having a lot of the same benefits for water that forests do for air, but also facilitating just an incredible natural abundance because of the three-dimensional landscape and all the things I just said. And when we ate all the oysters, which happened pretty quickly after New York City was colonized by Europeans, we cut that ecosystem off at the knees. So the harbor.
And this was in what, early 17th century? That's about when we colonized Manhattan.
Yeah, and it took about 100 years to eat all the oysters. So went from hand harvesting to using progressively more sophisticated harvesting techniques, and eventually dredging as a means of harvesting oysters.
And I'm sorry, were oysters one of those things like passenger pigeons and bison, where there were just so many of them, it was unimaginable that they could disappear?
Yeah. And there were signs, there were signs and there were some calls to stop. But we're not very good at, as a species, not very good at following those, heeding those calls. And so, it only took about 100 years, but it was initially, they were everywhere. They were along every shoreline. You could walk down to the waterfront and just grab a handful of oysters. And it did seem like a limitless resource for a period of time. And New York City was famous for its oysters. People came to New York to try the oysters, and they were packed in barrels and shipped all over the world. And it was a staple in the diet of people who lived here. Everyone, they weren't expensive early on. And so it was rich and poor alike. They ate oysters at restaurants or on street corners, and that no resource can withstand that level of harvest for that long. And so it only took, like I said, about 100 years. So by the mid to late 1700s, most of the native oyster reefs have been removed from the harbor.
Okay. All right. And then we've just lived without them for the last 200 years.
Well, there was another 100 years, so mid to late 1700s to mid to late 1800s, where where people were farming oysters in New York Harbor. And so the seed oysters were brought up from Delaware Bay. Small oysters were brought up from Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay and seeded on New York Harbor beds. And that was a livelihood for a lot of people, including a lot of free blacks who had moved north. There's a whole community on Staten Island focused on oyster aquaculture, and that worked. And people continued to eat the oysters until the completion of the Croton Aqueduct. This is a really fascinating part of the story, is that the population of New York City was water limited. So everyone was living off well water, and there wasn't enough of it to go around. And so the size of the city couldn't expand. And we responded to that by building the aqueduct system and getting fresh water from upstate. And that allowed the population to balloon. And New Yorkers, for a period of time, were consuming 10 times as much water as any other city per capita. And all of that water went through homes and out into the river. rivers, and that really destroyed the water quality of the harbor pretty quickly. All of that wastewater just going right out onto the oyster beds. Which,
So
you know,
continue, please.
well, I was just saying, and that in the early 1900s, people started getting sick because it came as a huge surprise to New Yorkers that pouring raw sewage directly on your food supply was a problem, and we were just starting to understand communicable diseases and what that was all about. So the cholera and typhoid outbreaks that resulted from that were blamed on the oysters and not on the wastewater system that was pouring human waste on the oyster reefs. And because of that, the last aquaculture beds were closed in I think 1921 was when the last one was closed. And then, so we've been living without oysters for 100 years, not for two or 300 years.
Okay. All right. And then backing up or sidetracking or tangential, whatever it might be, your family is in the aquaculture business.
Yeah, that's right. Well, my parents
So what does that mean? What does that mean to be in the aquaculture business?
So my parents started an oyster farm on Fisher's Island, New York in the early 80s, right? At the same time as they had me and my 4 siblings. And what that means is their mission in life was to be their own bosses and develop a business that did not have a negative impact on the planet. That was their mission. And so they
pretty good mission, by the way.
Turned to oyster farming because it's one of those things. It's a non-extractive form of food production. So there's it's the most sustainable protein source that I know of, and so they have a portion of the farm on land.
Let me stop you if I may, because you made a couple of important statements, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but you made a couple of interesting points. It's non-extractive. That's counterintuitive to me. We are pulling oysters out of the water, right? We're extracting oysters.
Well, on a farm, you're extracting oysters that you put there.
Okay, so it's net neutral.
Well, I would argue it's actually net positive because the oyster oyster farms provide all the same ecosystem services that oyster reefs do. And so the oysters are there living their lives, but they're also filtering the water, cleaning up after us. They're providing habitat for other animals. So an oyster farm is essentially an oyster reef that is providing habitat, making the ocean more productive, or that little piece of ocean more productive, and at the same time producing food. And so when you think about the impacts of food production, it's hard to find sort of restorative agriculture or aquaculture that's having a net positive impact on the planet.
So are they then culling the excess, or do they have to keep adding to it every year to replace what they've taken?
They add every year. So there's that farm, the Fisher's Island Oyster Farm, is a fully integrated farm. So there's a hatchery on land where young oysters where broodstock comes in, and you get the oysters to reproduce, and you raise the young oysters on land until they're big enough to go out into the harbor, and then they're contained their whole lives in these nets, where they just live suspended in the water, filter what's naturally there. And then after each year, the big ones are harvested and new small ones are added to the system.
Okay. All right. Well, that's fantastic. So a little different, say, than cattle ranching.
It depends. I think there's a lot of strong opinions about all different kinds of food production. But I definitely think that bivalve aquaculture is about as good as it gets. And it also helps you, if you're an oyster fan and you like eating oysters, knowing that eating farmed oysters, you're actually, by eating farmed oysters, you're creating the opportunity to have these restored reefs around that farmers are maintaining. And so it's one of the best things you can do for the planet is to eat farmed shellfish.
So and I know that there is some controversy about say farmed salmon, and some of the farmed fishes. That does not extend into farmed oysters?
Absolutely not. I mean, there's not none of the environmental issues that normally come up with finfish aquaculture apply to shellfish aquaculture. Okay. They don't move around on their own. They don't communicate diseases to natural populations. There's the waste. They're herbivores, and so they're eating what's phytoplankton that's naturally in the system. So there's no added food, no added pesticides, herbicides, electricity, fertilizer, anything like that. They're just eating what's naturally there. And I think that personally, I do think that there's plenty of things that aquaculture could be doing better. I think as an industry, the net negative impacts on the planet of aquaculture are so far less than land farming, that I think I think we tend to vilify fish farms because they exist in places that we associate as being important natural places. But a fish farm is, because the animals are thermal conformers, right? They're not trying to maintain their body temperature, and they're not walking around on four legs. They're actually, the feed conversion is much better for a finfish than it is for a cow or a pig or a chicken. I think that ultimately, me personally, I would prefer to eat a farm seafood over wild seafood, just because I think that we're tricking ourselves if we think we can harvest wild animals sustainably.
Okay. So is there pushback to farmed oysters? Is there I mean, I know there's pushback to every single thing that human beings do, but is there an organized other side of that equation, or is it a pretty innocuous business?
The biggest limiting factor to the expansion of shellfish aquaculture is wealthy landowners who don't want to look at it. So the idea that there's people working on the waterfront is, in some communities, that's something to be celebrated. In other communities, it's not. And so the sort of view shed argument, or the using part of nature to produce, to create a livelihood for someone, is problematic in some places, because people would rather just look at an empty waterway. But
is there licensing required, or
there's a lot of licensing and permitting, and that issue, the NIMBY issue for oyster farms, is the biggest thing that's limiting the growth of the industry.
Okay.
And so
the people who have those views also have the means to fight that for a while.
Yeah. And yes, that is true.
Okay. Well, let's shift back to your Billion Oysters. First of all, congratulations on the family business. That's a neat mission that your folks came up with. And, we could probably do an hour on that business, but I do want to talk about New York Harbor and the Billion Oysters and the project and whatnot. When did you wake up and say, hey, I think we could save New York Harbor? Because that's a pretty big question.
It was early on. It was, it wasn't, and I don't know if it even is now, although maybe it is, Save New York Harbor. It is what can we do? How can we help? How can we make this better? And it's not necessarily about solving the problem as much as it is about making positive progress. And it is clear that once we figured out that, we spent a couple of years testing whether or not oysters could survive in the harbor, whether or not they could reproduce, if their larvae could survive in the harbor, their offspring. And so there was a trial period of a few years when we were experimenting with that. But as soon as we knew that in the vast majority of the harbor, the water was clean enough and oysters could thrive, then it was obvious that this was something that we could do to help be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And then since then, we've just been trying to do as much of it as we can.
Now, you're not growing these as part of the aquaculture, as part of the family business. This is something you're just trying to seed and get started and hope it expands and multiplies and grows because of the health benefits it provides to the harbor, and then through that to the population of New York and whatnot, right?
Yeah, we have no aspirations of eating the oysters out of New York Harbor. And what we like to say is our oysters have a more important job to do than to be food. And so our hope is that by restoring oyster reefs throughout the harbor, we can get the population past a critical tipping point where it can start to grow on its own. And at that point, oyster populations are capable of exponential growth. They will be able to naturally do a lot more than what we're able to do every year. But the goal is to just provide a little support and get the population past that point by
And
putting
what
in.
is that point?
It's a great question. No one knows there's no way to know the exact answer. What we
Okay.
look at to understand our progress towards that is what we call wild recruitment. And that's just looking at the shoreline of New York City and looking for the presence of new oysters. So every year the oysters reproduce, their larvae swim around in the system for a couple of weeks, and then they find a suitable place to settle out, cement themselves to that substrate, and grow their own shells. And we can see by looking around the shoreline of the harbor, we've watched over the last 15 years the number and density of those recruitment events increase. And so we can tell that what we're doing is having an impact. We've been able to genetically tie those oysters to the oysters that we've restored. And we know that we're getting closer to a tipping point. We also know that we're not there yet.
So let me back you up again. How exciting was that when you first realized that some of the oysters that you were setting free or planting or whatever the term is, actually did reproduce, and that the larvae did catch on? So, I mean, that had to be a thrill.
It was incredibly thrilling. Early on, it was very rare. So seeing one little oyster show up on a new little oyster show up on one of our reefs or on one of the shells that we had in the water was a huge deal and very exciting. And it used to be super uncommon. And now it's much more common. At most of our reef sites, we see some recruitment, and generally anywhere you look, with a couple exceptions, most places you look in New York Harbor at a very low tide, you'll see oysters.
And a lot more than you saw a decade ago?
Yeah, where you saw none, there are many.
So I'm an old school marketing guy. That was my business. And so I understand the value of nice, big, huge round numbers. And you guys chose a billion. And certainly it's not an exact number, but why a billion? What is the attraction of that number of oysters in New York Harbor?
The point of the billion. I mean, when we were thinking about it, and we'd already started Harbor School's oyster restoration program that had been ongoing for a number of years when we launched Billion Oyster Project. And the inspiration for Billion Oyster Project was Million Trees NYC, which is an initiative, a public-private partnership between the New York Restoration Project and the Bloomberg administration to plant 1 million trees in New York City. And we were right in the middle of that when we started doing this at about 500,000 trees, and they've since completed the 1 million trees. And Billion Oyster Project originally our vision was to create the aquatic analog of Million Trees NYC and pitch it to the mayor. And so it was originally Billion Oysters NYC. So that's part of the story, is the inspiration from 1 million trees. But the point of the billion target is it's designed to be a rallying cry to say that we're committed to doing this no matter what. We're going to get to 1 billion oysters. It's going to be really hard. We're going to need everyone's help, and it's not. And it states our ambition from the start. We're trying to do this big hard thing that we don't know if it's possible, and we want everyone to help us to get this done. And that is a lot of the power of Billion Oyster Project is based around that idea that it's not a small thing. We're going to take a risk and go out on a limb and say we're going to do this until we get 1 billion. And that's part of the magic of Billion Oyster Project is saying that we have a big target.
But you've gone beyond an idea. You've gone beyond, is this possible, to it absolutely is possible. It's happening now, and we just need to keep moving forward. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
What percentage of the billion do you think is out there?
Well, we count the oysters that we put in the water. We don't count their offspring or anything like that towards our billion.
Okay.
And we know exactly how many oysters we've put in the water so far. because we count them, and it's about 100, just over 150 million oysters, which is
Okay.
which leaves us with 850 million to go before we get to a billion. And it's taken us 10 years, more than 10 years to get to that number.
Is it picking up speed?
Yeah, it better be. But it really took us 10 years to do the first 30 million oysters. And then in the last few years, we've gotten from there to over 150 million. And we plan to do close to 100 million next season alone, and then continue to tick up from there. We've actually accelerated our goal from 2035 to 2030. So now we only have a few more years.
I have to stop because nobody does that in the nonprofit world. Nobody modifies their date forward. They're always pushed back. I've sat on enough boards over the years. So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And I love the optimism, and that's fantastic. But what is now when you get to 1,850 million from now, do you stop or do you continue? Are you expanding outside of New York Harbor? Are you inspiring others in Boston or wherever else oysters can grow? What's happening there?
Quick answer is that I know for sure we won't have done enough in New York Harbor when we get to 1 billion. We'll want to continue restoring oysters in New York Harbor. I don't see anything wrong with Billion Oyster Project restoring 3 or 5 or 6 billion oysters in New York Harbor. I think so in New York Harbor, we plan to continue past 1 billion. And, we'll decide at some point whether or not we need to change it to Trillion Oyster Project. But I think we're a ways from that. And, but as far as expanding outside of New York City, the story I told at the beginning about estuaries is a New York City story is a very common story. There are important coastal estuaries all over the world that are now home to giant cities where we ate all the oysters, the water quality got really bad, it's starting to clean up, the animals are coming back. And if we can do the same type of intervention in those cities as well, there's the same justifications true in San Francisco and Miami and Boston and Baltimore and London. There's so many. 22 of the largest 30 cities on planet Earth are co-located with temperate estuaries that used to have thriving oyster populations and don't anymore.
Wow.
And wow, right? That's the right response, because we don't think of those places as important natural resources. And New York City is exactly the same. I don't know how you walked into this conversation, but generally speaking, people think about New York Harbor as this polluted, toxic sort of waste dump and are not thinking about it as an important natural resource. And we just have this concept as people that nature is separate from cities. But meanwhile, there are all these giant cities that have where half of the available land is water, and there's plenty of space in those waterways for restoration. So I don't think they should be separate. I don't think we should be leaving New York City to find nature. We should be finding nature here in town.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And I have to tell you, when I started this podcast, not our particular episode, but the overall, most of my early guests were birders, and there was a lot of conversation about that. I've written a couple of books about birds. I'm writing one now about mammals, and it was fascinating. And then the show has morphed into more of a conservation show, which certainly still involves birds. But I have interviewed your peers for chestnut trees, for grizzly bears, for redwoods, for wolves, for beavers. I mean, and the story is the same, the powerful impact that it can have. And I think part of that story that we need to share more with people is we can bring these things back. I mean, we can't bring back the ones that are extinct. But I interviewed yesterday a woman named Jody Hilty, who is the executive director or president or whatever the title is for the Yellowstone to Yukon project. And she's trying to develop a 2,000-mile corridor from Yellowstone National Park to Yukon in northern Canada for the migration of animals. And
Yeah.
her focus is on large carnivores, grizzlies, wolves, wolverines, and whatnot, and the cascading effect that they have on the environment and the habitat. And it's interesting because, that's massive, easy, brilliantly photographed. People gravitate toward that. And here you're developing something where you're going from the bottom up, right? I mean, you're going from oysters and saying, no, no, no. If we get oysters, it will help us clean up the harbor. It will bring back the other animals and the fish, and overall, we all benefit. And then it becomes a template for the other 21 major estuary/city combinations that you mentioned. So I think what you're doing is fascinating, and it's important work. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you're right. I don't know that the general public believed that there was anything left to save in New York Harbor.
Yeah.
That it was just kind of gone. And the idea that it can be brought back and could be healthy again is exciting. It's invigorating, and I think it's a powerful, powerful message that needs to get out there. So first of all, most important, congratulations and thank you for the work you're doing. I think it's incredibly important. It's been nagging at me to ask you, what is a life expectancy of a non-eaten oyster?
There's some debate about that. Uh, eh. So, listeners, feel free to fact check me on this, but as far as I know, there's no natural senescence in oysters, so they can live for a very long time.
Okay.
However, everything kills them. So there there's a couple parasites that cause problems in most places, and they're a food for all manner of different animals. So in New York Harbor, they're eaten by,
Who eats
including
them?
people. Okay, so in New York Harbor, oyster drills are these tiny little predatory snails that drill a hole in the shell of oysters, secrete sulfuric acid to melt the meat, and then suck out the juice. Pretty cool. Mud crabs, blue crabs. The lobsters are mostly gone, but lobsters do eat oysters, starfish, blackfish, um, oyster toadfish, all eat oysters. And so so when we see an oyster that's more than 5 years old, that's exciting. Some of the biggest oysters that we've seen in the harbor are probably 10 years old. But we haven't been doing this long enough to see how long they go or how big they
Okay.
get.
But that's a
There
positive
are,
thing. They're providing food
yeah,
for
it's part of
other animals that we're also hoping come back, right?
it's part of the ecosystem. A thriving
Okay.
oyster reef is supposed to be a food source for a lot of different animals, and so that's what we expect and hope is that we're feeding a lot of we're feeding the ecosystem in addition to supporting the ecosystem. The historically, the oysters were huge in New York Harbor because they had an opportunity to live for such a long time, and so there's stories of oysters the size of feet long, and eating them with knives and forks and all of that. So I think we don't see those anymore because all the oysters are harvested before they get to that size, but they have the capacity to get really big.
I remember as a kid when I was scuba diving back in the early 70s, we would find what we would call dinner plate scallops
Yep.
and massive abalones, and most of those are gone, if not all of them. But they were sure fun to find back then. And same
Yep.
thing, you get a giant, what we call a dinner plate scallop, and you're going at it with a knife and a fork. You're not just, popping them in, and that was a cool thing. Maybe those will come back as well. So tell me about Urban Assembly New York Harbor School.
Yeah. I'm a former Harbor School teacher. I taught high school there for 5 years, and Harbor School is central to everything we do at Billion Oyster Project. And And it's a good segue to the other half of Billion Oyster Project, which we haven't been talking about that much or at all, which is all of our education programs.
Next on my list.
But those start at Harbor School, and the oyster restoration was developed initially as a teaching tool, as a narrative for teaching and learning in a high school classroom. So I was teaching the aquaculture class. We were raising oysters for the purpose of restoration and using that as a way to learn the science and business of aquaculture. And Harbor School has now 8 different career and technical education pathways. So it's a normal Regents high school on one hand, but then also there's the students specialize in one of these 8 fields and then spend a lot of their high school day focusing on those as they, in the higher grades.
And this is a public high school.
It's a public high school. It's unscreened. There's no test to get in. It's a lottery. Anyone is eligible to go. The odds of getting in are relatively low because there's a lot of interest, but it's open to anybody. And the different career pathways are aquaculture, vessel operations, professional scuba diving, marine biology, ocean engineering, marine policy, environmental advocacy, marine systems, and welding. And the students begin specializing in those fields after their 9th grade year, after their first year. And then in the older grades, as they spend more time in those programs, they spend more time working on Billion Oyster Project stuff. And one of the reasons we shifted from Harbor School's oyster restoration program to Billion Oyster Project early on is because we realized that we needed experts in all of those different fields in order to restore oysters to New York Harbor. So we needed engineers and scientists and boat drivers and scuba divers and et cetera. And Billion Oyster Project became the way that all of those students in the different disciplines could work together on a single project.
That's fantastic. Now, I pulled some numbers from your website, and I want you to talk about these because they're pretty impressive numbers. 19,000 volunteers, 30,000 students. You're involved with 100 different New York City schools and 83 restaurants and 17 active restoration sites. I mean, from a vision that you and your co-founder had, that's a crap load of growth in a decade. Tell us what those volunteers do, what the students do, what the relationship is with the other 99 New York City schools. Help us understand how that's working.
Yeah, and that's the other reason why doing this work in cities is so important, is that ultimately every problem, every challenge facing planet Earth is a people problem, and people need to make different decisions in order to solve those problems, right? Whether it's climate change, ocean plastic, carnivore pathways, whatever it is, there are people who have disrupted those things, and we need to work together to solve them. And what Billion Oyster Project does better than very well, is to get people excited about their own agency in improving nature, or in having less of a negative impact and a positive impact on the planet. So we want everyone in New York City to know that they have the power to affect positive change through the decisions they make every day and the work they do in school. And we show that by engaging people in the work of restoring oysters to New York Harbor. And that's through our volunteer programs. We run volunteer programs every day out on Governor's Island. And we want people to come out because we need their help, but also because we want them to know that they have the power to help restore New York Harbor. We want that to be a thing that everyone in New York City knows. So when you say 100 schools, 30,000 students, 19,000 volunteers, all those sound like big numbers, but we're still pretty far from getting everyone. That's what we want. And
you're also pretty far from zero, which is what you had a decade ago. So I appreciate the modesty, but let's not minimize what you've accomplished. So what do the 19,000 volunteers do? If I'm volunteering for your project and I'm a junior at one of these 100 New York City schools, what am I doing?
You're coming out to Governor's Island. The most common volunteer activity is processing shells. So we collect thousands of pounds of shell from New York City restaurants every week. That shell comes out to Governor's Island. It needs to be cleaned and separated by size and put into different containers for our restoration projects. And that's the most common volunteer activity. We do a lot of, second to that, we do some cage building because some of our oysters and I'll talk about this in a second with the schools. Some of our oysters are suspended in cages that volunteers make. Depending on the time of year, the volunteer work sort of mirrors the work that we have going on at the organization. So sometimes in the spring and early summer, we're counting small oysters or helping to build our reef sites. That's the volunteers. And then the schools.
Well, I'm sorry. Let me ask a couple questions on that before we move on. Your site mentions that you're working with 83 restaurants. Are those the ones where you're gathering the shells? They're
That's
saving
correct.
the shells for you. So
Yep.
what is the value to you of shells of now eaten oysters?
Well, oysters, they have two different life stages. So just like caterpillar and a butterfly. So in their larval stage, they're free swimming, and then they attach to a substrate, grow their own shells, and then never move again for the rest of their lives. And their preferred substrate is oyster shells. That's a genetic adaptation so that young oyster larvae end up in places where oysters can live.
Okay.
And actually, what they prefer more than shell is live oysters over anything else. They'll try to attach themselves to other live oysters, and that's why they're a reef building organism. So we need the shells because we need there to be more shells in the harbor, so there's more homes for young oysters to attach. And we build our reefs often out of shell substrate in one way or another. The other
why are you sizing them? It would seem to me you would just take a bunch of shells, wash them off with a power washer, and dump them in where you'd want them. But obviously that's not what happens. So how does it happen?
The reason when we're sizing them, what we're really doing is getting rid of shell fragments. So we want the pieces of shell to be large enough so that it can be held in a mesh container. And so we don't want the little young oysters to attach to small pieces of shell that will just float away. We want it to be secure in that way. And the other cool thing about oyster shells is that they're all unique, right? So we did this with scallop shells. Scallop shells nest together. And so a stack of scallop shells has much less interstitial space than a stack of oyster shells because they don't nest. They're very unique shape. And that's the other thing that's really good for when we're getting the oyster larvae to attach to the shell, we're introducing oyster larvae to large containers of oyster shell. We want the larvae to swim around and attach to all that available surface area.
Okay. And you've mentioned Governor's Island a couple of times. Is that where all 17 of the restoration sites are?
No, that's our home base. Our headquarters is where Harbor School is, and that's our jumping off point. That's where we grow the oysters. But the reef sites are all throughout the harbor. And New York Harbor is huge. It's 200,000 acres. We have oyster sites all the way up at the Tappan Zee Bridge, out in Western Long Island Sound, in Raritan Bay, which is between Staten Island and New Jersey, and Jamaica Bay. We have sites that are 20 miles from Governor's Island in 4 different directions.
That's fantastic. Now, one of the things that was mentioned on the website is that you have recycled almost 3 million pounds of shells. So I was wondering what that recycling is. Is that the stuff you gather from the restaurants and bring it back out? So you're keeping that from going into the landfills and instead converting it to something of value to the environment. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. And it would all be in landfills if we weren't collecting it. And instead, most of those 3 million pounds are back in New York Harbor doing good.
And is there a limit to how many of those you can have? I mean, you say you're working with 83 restaurants currently. Could you double that and still use all the shells? You've got a young visitor, don't you?
Yeah, this is Daisy Lee. She's homesick, although she seems to be feeling
Hello,
a lot better.
Daisy Lee. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. But welcome to the podcast. Are you more interesting than your dad?
Much more interesting.
Cuter for sure.
Yeah.
I've seen the hair pop in a couple times behind you over the last half hour. I was wondering, and there we go. Well, welcome, Daisy Lee. Let's listen to your father and the brilliance and genius that he is bringing to our audience. So I'm sorry, and maybe Daisy Lee has the answer, but could you double the amount of oyster shells that you're utilizing now, or is there a capacity, a limit?
No, the limit is our ability to collect the shell. So we would like to get every oyster shell that's generated in New York City out of the waste stream, and we're able to collect as many as we are. That's a function of the funding that we have for that program and the interest of restaurants in separating their shells, which is a non-trivial task for restaurants to separate and store their shells.
So it's a commitment that these 83 restaurants have made then.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Okay. All right. Well, then congratulations to them as well. That's a really cool thing. So now the volunteers are also helping you. And what is it called? Are you planting the oysters? What's the proper term?
But we say we're restoring oysters, or installing is the other term that we use when we're building a reef. And so it's not unlike planting, but those are the terms that we normally use. Yeah.
Okay. And then tell us again, let's assume this vision comes true, not the other 21 major cities around the country and around the world, but just in New York and New York Harbor. And let's assume the Billion really is the tipping point, and now the oysters are, growing on their own, hopefully geometrically. So a couple questions come to mind. Number one, can we have too many oysters in the harbor? Is that a possibility? And number two, explain to us again, in an ideal world, where you think we wind up. What are the fish that are coming back? What are the marine mammals that are using the harbor, if any? And tell me where we go in our perfect world.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, if we did nothing, if the Billion Oyster Project didn't exist, eventually all this stuff would probably happen, could happen. It would just take a much longer time. So right now, because the water quality in New York Harbor is so much better than it has been in so long, tons of animals are coming back on their own.
I've got to stop you again. Why is the quality of the water gotten better, and what animals are coming back?
Yeah, when in the 70s, up until the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, the New York Harbor was seen as a clean port to shipping interests. So they could bring their boats into New York Harbor and count on all of the animals on the bottom of their boats dying. So that was one of the reasons it was good to come and do business in New York Harbor if you were a shipping company, because you knew that it would clean your boat.
Okay, I did not know that. That is a terrible thing.
And we have one of our.
By the way, the term for that the harbor is so toxic is that it was a clean harbor,
clean port. And actually, one of our board members works for the Port Authority, and she used to work in the port department, and remembers getting angry calls from shipping interests when they realized that the animals on their boats weren't dying when they came into the harbor, and they're incurring the real cost of having to clean their boats because they didn't have that benefit anymore. So
these are what, barnacles or what?
Barnacles. Whatever else. Probably mostly barnacles, but whatever else is on boats. And
I'd never heard that before. That's going to stick with me for a while.
Pretty wild. And the reason for that, the primary reason for that change, is the passage of the Clean Water Act. So in 1972, it became illegal to pollute in our nation's waterways. And very slowly over time, New York City has gotten better at following those rules. And the most impactful change was treating our wastewater. So, and that took, from 1972 till 1986 before the 14 wastewater treatment plants were complete. But once they were, on dry days, most days, all of the household wastewater in New York City is treated before it enters the harbor. And that alone has caused this profound shift in the water quality in the harbor, going from a time when it would clean your boat, when the harbor was off-putting to be around, when it smelled bad and looked gross, and saw the, diapers and toilet paper floating down the river and all that.
I remember all that. I worked for companies that were based in New York, so I traveled. I lived in California, but I traveled there often, and it was just abysmal. It was terrible to go look at, and I think that kind of stuck with me over the years.
Yeah, and that's part of the culture of New York City. Anyone you ask in New York, would you swim in the East River? Say no, we come back without a foot. But the reality is that the East River is the cleanest part of New York Harbor and is safe to swim in most days of the year. If it was a beach, it would be open by EPA standards, and people don't know that. And there still are water quality problems, and every time it rains, the wastewater system is inundated, and all that nasty stuff still flows out into the harbor. And for 24 or 48 hours after a rain event, you don't want to swim in the harbor. But that is it. But it has been an enormous improvement. And so all the animals that used to thrive in the harbor are back in the harbor at drastically reduced numbers. But it's not uncommon for us to find seahorses in our oyster cages, anemones, mussels, clams, scallops, all of that. We see this sturgeon are in New York Harbor, 2 species of sturgeon. There's we see dolphins, whales, seals, all coming back to the harbor. And the bird life is something that I get really excited about, and has been incredible to see over the last 15 years, the resurgence of all of these different species of wading birds and diving ducks. And I'm pretty sure that right now, New York Harbor is one of, if not the best place to see wading birds in the Northeast. I mean, there's on the northern tip of Manhattan, there are dozens of nesting pairs of great blue herons. Where else do you see that? Hundreds of night herons in Newtown Creek and the Bronx River. See kingfishers in the winter. See loons, buffleheads, golden eyes, bluebills, all of those ducks coming back, mergansers. And I'm sure that in 10 years or 20 years, it will be obvious to everybody that we're surrounded by wild animals. And that's the part of that is all of the various efforts to restore New York Harbor, take better care of the resource, reduce water quality impacts, restore oysters. It's all part of that improvement. But it is remarkable to watch just over the last 15 years how that's happened. And there's a one spot in the Arthur Kill between Staten Island and New Jersey where you can see 15 osprey nests from one place, and that's not common.
I wrote a book on raptors called Raptor Quest, and osprey are my favorite. So
yeah,
that's
me too.
I take it you're a birder.
Yeah, I mean, I've become one because it's just super exciting to watch them come back. And there's peregrine falcons nesting in the Brooklyn Bridge. All of this stuff is happening. And so to answer your question, what does New York Harbor look like when we're done? One big change is that's obvious to everybody. That it's not just me and our staff who have the luxury of spending a lot of time on boats in the harbor and gets to see this stuff, but everyone in New York City knows and is proud of the fact that we have this incredible natural resource all around us. The other change is that New York City is a waterfront city again, and New Yorkers know and enjoy being on the water and being in the water. And if you go to Chicago in the summertime, everyone's on the water. There's a beach in town and everyone's swimming, laying out on the beach. There are tons of small boats running around all over the place. And New York City should have that also. There are imagine if on a hot day in August, everyone could just jump in the water and or jump on a kayak and enjoy this incredible resource we have. So it's really two big changes that we're trying to have an impact on. One is just the abundance and diversity of wildlife, and then the second is just how New Yorkers think about and use the harbor.
Well, I think it's spectacular. And I'm going to guess there's more that we want to talk about. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our hour, but I would love to have you back as a guest
Yeah,
down the
sure.
road just so we can talk about more of this stuff. So I'm going to throw my email up here right now. If you're listening and not watching, it's scott@naturallyscott.com. Any questions you have about the show or about Pete or for Pete, send them to me and I'll get them off to him, and we'll do that. And Pete, while that is up there, I had asked you if you had a book, something nature related, that you could share with the audience that you think might be of value for them to read. So go for it.
Well, I think probably my favorite book I read this year is Carbon by Paul Hawken. And it's hard to describe. It's a nonfiction book, but it's about all of the interconnectedness of all of the different natural systems and the way that interplay between that and how we think about the world. And it's I learned so much reading that book. And
well, the cover of it will be up now if you're watching on YouTube, and it sounds like a book that I want to read because I've gotten more fascinated with this just in the months I've been doing this podcast. And I just, I love your story with the oysters, but I'm hearing that story over and over and over. Just, replace oysters with grizzly bears or wolves or butterflies or redwood trees or chestnuts. And it's the same thing. And not to minimize it, by the way, it's a compliment that there are people out there like you that are so passionate and so willing to invest their time and effort and education into making the world a better and a safer place. And I think that's pretty cool. So thank you very much for that. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit subscribe. The more subscribers we get, the more people watch this and the more the message gets out there. Pete wants to educate everybody in New York City. I don't know why we can't educate everybody everywhere. So the more people, the better, and allows us to bring in more guests. No cost to you. Just hit subscribe, maybe drop a comment or hit like, and that would be fantastic. Pete, thank you so much. Thank you for the hour that you've shared with us and the audience, and mostly for the work that you're doing. And I love that you're inspiring young people. I think that's fantastic that there's a school that's involved in this where there's a waiting list to get in. That this is the future. These are the people that are going to have to pick up the ball when the rest of us have gotten a little tired and set it down. Maybe your daughter could be one of those. So thank you very much, Pete. I sincerely appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for shining a light on our work.
Oh, you bet. It's going to hopefully be a bright light, and it's one I'll be talking about on other shows. And by the way, this came from my son, Justin. He's a producer of the show, and he came to me just before I contacted you. He's the reason I did. He said, Dad, I've been reading about this oyster stuff and this guy doing this work in New York. You got to have him on the show. So I had not heard of you or the Billion Oyster Project or any of that, and now I'm all into it. It's kind of cool, and maybe we'll get a chance to meet next time I'm up in New York City.
Yep. Reach out, let me know.
Absolutely, I will. And as I wrap up every show, I do the same thing. I encourage people to get outside, volunteer, hike, photograph, whatever you want to do. Just get out of the four walls, and when you do, make sure that you stay safe and stay curious. Thanks so much for being with us today. Take care. Pete, once again, thank you.
Of course. Thanks.